Be Jonah 28, mechanical engineer. For the past few years, I've had what I can only describe as the perfect job, not in the sense of making millions, but in that I actually wanted to go to work every day. The place was a custom fabrication shop. We made high-end props and practical effects for the film industry. If a director needed a hero's futuristic weapon with glowing parts and a functioning trigger mechanism, they came to us. If they needed a detailed spaceship cockpit console that could withstand an actor smashing it, we were the guys to call. It was a dream for someone like me, who grew up building things out of spare parts in my dad's garage. The workshop was my sanctuary, a huge, open space that always smelled of ozone from the welders, hot metal, and sawdust. It was organized chaos, but we knew where everything was. The founder was this old-school guy, a brilliant craftsman who started the company in the 80s. He was tough, fair, and valued one thing above all else: skill. His motto was simple: I don't care who you are or where you're from. Can you do the work? Because of him, the place had zero corporate baggage. No HR department, no pointless meetings, no buzzwords, just a group of guys who were the best at what they did. My role was design and modeling. I took the concept art from the studios and turned it into functional CAD models and blueprints that could actually be built. Then there was Tanner. Tanner was the lead fabricator, a guy in his 50s with hands like leather and an encyclopedic knowledge of every material known to man. He was the kind of guy who could look at my complex digital model, grunt, and then build it perfectly using a welder, a lathe, and a healthy amount of stubbornness. He didn't talk much, but when he did, you listened. He'd been with the founder since the beginning. And finally, there was Braden. Braden was our client guy. He wasn't a salesman in the slimy sense. He was a former fabricator himself, so he knew our craft inside and out. He could talk to a stressed-out director, understand their vision, and translate it into technical terms for us, all while managing expectations and budgets. The big studios trusted him completely because he never promised something we couldn't deliver. The three of us, along with a handful of other skilled guys in the shop, were the core of the company. We worked like a well-oiled machine. I'd design it, Tanner would build it, and Braden would make sure the client was happy and the checks cleared. We once had an insane rush job for a big sci-fi movie. They needed a dozen complex rifle props in less than a month. The three of us practically lived at the workshop. I was tweaking designs at 3 a.m. while Tanner was machining parts, and Braden was on the phone with the studio, giving them progress updates and keeping them calm. We delivered on time, and the props were the highlight of the movie's marketing. The studio gave us a massive bonus and a contract for all their future projects. That's the kind of place it was: pure meritocracy and camaraderie. Then, about a year ago, the founder announced his retirement. He told us he was tired and wanted to spend time with his grandkids. He deserved it. He gathered everyone in the workshop and told us he was handing the reins over to his daughter, Scarlett. A bit of a quiet tension filled the room. None of us had ever met her. We knew she'd gone to some fancy business school on the other side of the country and hadn't spent any real time in the shop. She stepped forward to say a few words. She was probably around my age, dressed in a sharp, formal business suit that looked completely out of place next to our dusty workbenches. She talked about honoring her father's legacy while pivoting towards a more modern, structured, and socially conscious business paradigm. A lot of us exchanged glances. We didn't know what any of that meant, but it sounded like trouble. Still, she was the founder's daughter, so we gave her the benefit of the doubt. We figured she'd just handle the paperwork and let us keep doing our thing. We were wrong. For the first month or two, she was mostly an observer. She'd walk through the workshop with a tablet, taking notes, asking questions that didn't make much sense. She asked Tanner why we didn't have more ergonomic and emotionally supportive seating in the break room. He just stared at her, then pointed to an old couch with a busted spring and said, "We sit there. It works." She asked me why our design files weren't stored on some new, trendy cloud platform that was popular with graphic design startups. I explained that our files were huge and highly confidential, and our secure, closed-loop server was faster and safer. She just nodded slowly, typing on her tablet with a look that said, "My answer was wrong." The first concrete change was the introduction of mandatory weekly team synergy meetings. Every Monday morning, we had to stop work for an hour and sit in the conference room. Scarlett would stand at the front with a PowerPoint presentation full of stock photos of diverse people smiling in offices. She'd talk about key performance indicators and brand identity and stakeholder engagement. It was death by 1,000 buzzwords. Most of us just tuned out, thinking about the project deadlines getting closer. Tanner once fell asleep and started snoring lightly until Braden nudged him. After the meetings, she started sending out company-wide emails, long, rambling memos about her vision for the company. She wanted us to be more than just a prop shop. She wanted us to be a thought leader in the industry, a beacon of progressive values. We just wanted to build cool stuff for movies. Then she hired an outside consultant. This consultant's job was to evaluate and reshape our corporate culture. He spent a week interviewing all of us one-on-one. He asked me questions like, "On a scale of 1 to 10, how validated do you feel in your role? And can you describe a time you felt your contributions were not emotionally acknowledged?" I told him I feel validated when the props I design work perfectly on set and the director is happy. He wrote that down, but he looked disappointed. A few weeks later, the consultant's report came out. Scarlett presented it to us in another mandatory meeting. The report concluded that our workplace culture was functional but problematic. It cited a lack of expressive vulnerability, an over-reliance on individual heroics, and a homogeneous, male-coded communication style. It recommended a series of mandatory workshops to fix these issues. That's when things really started to go downhill. The workshops were a joke. Every other Friday afternoon, the whole shop had to shut down. The first one was about mindful communication. We had to pair up and stare into each other's eyes for a full minute without talking. I was paired with Tanner. We just stood there, completely silent, thinking about a complex gearbox assembly we were supposed to be finishing. It was the most awkward minute of my life. Another workshop was on identifying and dismantling workplace toxicity. The facilitator, a woman who had never worked a day in a machine shop, tried to explain to us that things like blunt feedback and focusing only on the task were forms of subtle aggression. Tanner, in his usual direct way, asked how he was supposed to tell a junior fabricator he was about to use the wrong welding rod on $1 million project without being blunt. The facilitator told him he should first ask the junior guy how he's feeling, validate his emotional state, and then gently guide him to the correct choice through collaborative inquiry. Tanner just shook his head and didn't say another word for the rest of the session. We all saw this as a massive waste of time. The work started piling up. We were craftsmen. Our communication was built on trust and a shared understanding of the work. We were direct because precision matters. A millimeter off in my design could mean a prop doesn't work. There was no room for ambiguity. Scarlett didn't see it that way. She saw our efficiency as a problem to be solved. She believed our way of working was a form of toxic masculinity that needed to be rooted out. She started putting up posters in the break room with slogans like, "Empathy is our greatest tool," and "Speak your truth." Someone drew a mustache on one of the posters. She held a meeting about it, calling it an act of vandalism and a sign of the deep-seated resistance to change. The final straw came a few months ago, maybe sometime in late spring. Scarlett sent out a company-wide email with the subject line, "Important. New Communication Policy Mandate. The email announced that, effective immediately, all employees were required to list their preferred pronouns in their email signatures on their company profiles and to state them at the beginning of any meeting with a new person. The policy stated that intentionally or repeatedly failing to use a person's correct pronouns would be considered a serious HR violation, subject to disciplinary action up to and including termination. I read the email 3 times. It felt like something from a different planet. We had a small team. We all knew each other. We had worked together for years. We called each other by our names. I walked over to Tanner's workbench. He was looking at the email on his own computer, his face like stone. Braden came over from his office, holding his phone. "Did you guys see this?" We all knew this was a line being drawn in the sand. This wasn't about respect for us. It was about compliance. It was a power play. It had absolutely nothing to do with building better movie props. It was a distraction, another layer of corporate nonsense designed to get in the way of actual work. We didn't organize a protest or anything like that. We just didn't do it. We kept sending emails without the new signatures. In meetings, we continued to introduce ourselves by our names and titles. When talking to each other, we used names. "Hey Jonah, I need those schematics." "Tanner, what's the ETA on the actuator housing?" It was simple. It was efficient. It had worked for years. For about a week, nothing happened. But we could feel the temperature dropping. Scarlett would walk through the shop, and her eyes would narrow every time she saw one of us. She started having closed-door meetings with the employees who had eagerly adopted the new policy. Then the warnings started. The 3 of us each got a formal, written warning from HR, which was now a department of 1 person she'd hired. The warnings cited our failure to adhere to the new communication policy and lack of commitment to fostering an inclusive environment. We were instructed to update our signatures immediately and to attend a remedial training session on the importance of pronouns. We ignored the warnings. The whole thing was ridiculous. We had a huge project for a medieval fantasy film that was already behind schedule because of all the workshop shutdowns for her mandatory fun time. Braden tried to talk to her. He went to her office and calmly explained our position. He told her that we respected everyone we worked with, but this policy felt like forced speech. He also mentioned that a few of our oldest clients, gruff, no-nonsense production managers, would be confused or even annoyed by these new formalities. He suggested that maybe the policy could be optional. According to Braden, she didn't listen to a word he said. She told him that his concern for the client's feelings over the employee's safety was a perfect example of the problematic culture she was trying to change. She said the policy was non-negotiable and that his resistance was duly noted. That's when we knew our time was probably limited. We didn't even talk about it much. We just put our heads down and tried to get as much work done as possible. It felt like we were trying to finish one last great project before the ship went down. The end came on a Tuesday. The 3 of us were called into her office at the same time. The HR person was there, sitting silently in the corner with a notepad. Scarlett was sitting behind her big, sterile desk. She didn't ask us to sit down. She started with a prepared speech. It was full of the same corporate jargon we'd been hearing for months. She talked about her vision for the company, about the importance of a unified culture, and about the painful but necessary process of moving forward. Then she got to the point. She said that our continued and deliberate defiance of company policy had created a fractured and hostile work environment. She claimed that other employees had come to her saying they felt unsafe and unsupported because of our refusal to comply. She said we had been given multiple opportunities to correct our behavior, but had chosen to double down on a posture of toxic resistance. She then said that, effective immediately, our employment was terminated. Tanner let out a short, sharp laugh. Not a happy one. Just a single bitter bark of disbelief. Braden just stood there, looking disappointed, but not surprised. I just felt a strange sense of calm. It was over. The slow, painful bleed out of the company we loved was finally done, at least for us. She slid 3 envelopes across the desk. She told us they contained our final paychecks and severance agreements. The agreements included a non-disclosure clause, preventing us from talking about the company or the circumstances of our termination. Her final words were, "Security will escort you to your workstations to collect your personal belongings." We didn't say anything to her. There was nothing to say. We didn't sign the agreements. We just turned around and walked out of her office. A security guard we'd never seen before was waiting for us. He followed us into the workshop. The place was silent. Everyone had stopped working and was just watching us. Some of the younger guys, the ones Scarlett had hired recently, looked away. A few of the old-timers, guys who had worked with Tanner for over a decade, looked furious, but they knew they couldn't do anything. I packed up my desk, my personal tools, a few books, a picture of my dog. It didn't take long. Tanner slowly and deliberately wiped down each of his tools at his workbench, oiled them, and placed them in his large, worn leather tool chest. It was like a religious ritual. Braden cleared out his office in 5 minutes flat. As we walked toward the exit, Astrid, the office manager who had been there forever, came running over. She had tears in her eyes. She gave each of us a quick hug and whispered, "I'm so sorry. This is insane." We told her it wasn't her fault and to take care of herself. The security guard held the door open for us. The 3 of us stepped out into the parking lot. The afternoon sun felt weirdly bright. We stood there for a moment, the door to the workshop closing behind us with a heavy final click. For the first time in years, we were unemployed. The company we had helped build, the place we had poured our sweat and creativity into, was now in the hands of someone who thought pronouns were more important than production schedules. We looked at each other. Tanner finally broke the silence. "Well, who wants a beer?" And that was the end of the best job I ever had. Or so I thought. We ended up at a dive bar down the street from the workshop, the kind of place with sticky floors and a jukebox that only plays classic rock. We sat in a worn-out booth, and Tanner ordered a pitcher. For a while, nobody said anything. We just listened to the clinking of glasses and the low murmur of the other patrons. The shock was starting to wear off, replaced by a dull, simmering anger. Not just at being fired, but at the sheer stupidity of it all. The waste. The destruction of something that worked so well for reasons that had nothing to do with work. Braden was the first to speak. He was scrolling through his phone, looking at job listings. He said there were plenty of sales gigs out there, but none of them were like what we had. He'd be selling software or medical devices, not something he actually understood or cared about. I knew what he meant. I could get another engineering job, probably with better pay and benefits, but I'd be sitting in a cubicle designing some soulless component for a massive corporation, a tiny cog in a giant machine. The magic of seeing my designs come to life in the hands of a master craftsman would be gone. Tanner took a long drink of his beer. He looked older than he had that morning. He said he didn't even know where to start. Most fabrication shops were either huge, automated factories or tiny, one-man operations. A place like ours, that perfect blend of size, skill, and creative freedom, was a unicorn. We talked for hours. We talked about old projects, about the founder, about how things used to be. It felt like a wake. As the night wore on, the anger started to fade, replaced by something else, a kind of defiant energy. I remember looking at the 2 of them. Braden, with his unmatched network of contacts and his knack for closing deals. Tanner, who could build literally anything you could imagine. And me, with the ability to bridge the gap between imagination and reality. We had all the pieces. The idea started as a joke. I think Tanner was the one who said it. We should just do it ourselves, in my garage. We all laughed, but then we stopped. We looked at each other, and the same thought clicked in all our heads at the same time. Why not? The next few weeks were a blur of activity and hushed phone calls. We kept getting updates from Astrid, who was still working at the old company. It was like getting dispatches from a sinking ship. She told us Scarlett had hired our replacements within a week. The new engineer who took my place was a recent graduate. Astrid said his main qualification seemed to be that he ran a campus club dedicated to social activism. He showed up to the workshop on his first day wearing a blazer and tried to lead a listening session with the remaining fabricators. The new head of fabrication, Tanner's replacement, was apparently some kind of conceptual artist who worked with reclaimed materials. He spent his first 2 days walking around the workshop, touching the machines and talking about their industrial karma. The new client manager, replacing Braden, was a young woman who was very active on social media. Her professional experience was in managing online brand communities. The first reports of disaster came quickly. The big medieval fantasy project we had been working on was the first casualty. The new engineer couldn't figure out my CAD files. He told Scarlett that my designs were overly complex and rigid. He proposed a more collaborative and intuitive design process, which involved the team making sketches on a whiteboard. The studio's production manager, a guy we'd worked with for years, called a meeting to see the prototypes. There were no prototypes, just a whiteboard full of doodles. The project was immediately pulled from us. That was a massive financial hit. Next, the machinery started breaking down. The conceptual artist who replaced Tanner decided that one of the CNC milling machines had a negative aura. He tried to cleanse it by performing some kind of ritual that involved burning sage and chanting, and in the process, he managed to pour some kind of essential oil into the machine's control panel. The panel shorted out with a flash and a puff of smoke. The machine, a $250,000 piece of equipment, was dead. Astrid told us the artist wasn't fired. Scarlett called it a learning opportunity and organized a workshop on forging a harmonious relationship with our tools. Meanwhile, Braden was getting calls. His old clients, the ones he'd built relationships with over a decade, were calling his personal cell. They were frustrated. The new client manager was sending them lengthy emails about the company's new social mission, but was completely clueless about the technical aspects of their orders. One of them told Braden she had tried to lecture a veteran stunt coordinator about the problematic nature of on-screen violence in his action film. He had hung up on her. One by one, the big clients started pulling their contracts. Scarlett's reaction, according to Astrid, was to blame the clients for not being aligned with our new corporate values. She genuinely believed she was in the right. She thought the problem wasn't her management, but the world's refusal to adapt to her vision. While this was all happening, we were making moves. We pooled our savings. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a down payment on a small used CNC machine and a lease on a dingy industrial unit on the outskirts of town. Tanner's garage was too small, but we found a place that was basically a concrete box with a roll-up door. It was perfect. We spent 2 weeks just setting up the place. We ran our own electrical, built our own workbenches, and calibrated the machines ourselves. It was hard, dirty work, but it felt good. It felt real. We were building something from the ground up with our own hands. We needed a name. We threw around a bunch of ideas, but most of them were too fancy. Finally, Tanner suggested something simple: the Forge. It fit. It was about creating things with skill and fire. We added works to make it sound a bit more professional, and so Forge Works was born. Once we were set up, Braden made his first call. He called the production manager from the medieval fantasy film, the one whose project had been the first to get derailed. Braden didn't trash our old company. He was professional. He just said, "Hey, it's Braden. Me, Jonah, and Tanner have started our own shop. We're small, but we're ready to work. I know you're in a tough spot with that project. We can still make your deadline." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then the production manager said, "Send me a quote and a new contract, now." That was our first job. It was a massive gamble. The deadline was brutal. For the next month, the three of us lived at the forge. I was at the computer 16 hours a day, refining the designs and programming the tool paths for the CNC machine. Tanner was a one-man army on the workshop floor, cutting, welding, grinding, and assembling. Braden was handling the logistics, ordering materials, and keeping the client updated with daily photos and progress reports. We finished the project with 2 days to spare. The props were perfect, intricate, durable, and exactly what the client wanted. When we delivered them, the production manager looked like he was going to cry with relief. He paid our invoice within 24 hours, and he gave us a contract for 2 more movies on the spot. The word started to spread. Braden didn't have to make cold calls anymore. His phone started ringing on its own. One by one, our old clients found us. It was always the same story. They had tried to work with the new team at our old company and had been burned by incompetence and bizarre ideological lectures. They were desperate for a shop that just did the work, no strings attached. Within 3 months, we had more work than we could handle. We hired 2 of the best fabricators who had quit the old shop shortly after we were fired. They were thrilled to come work with us. They said the old place had turned into a nightmare of endless meetings and passive-aggressive notes. Our little concrete box of a workshop was humming with activity. It was loud, chaotic, and productive. It felt like home. Meanwhile, the news from the old company got worse and worse. Astrid told us they were hemorrhaging money. They hadn't successfully completed a major project since we left. Scarlett had doubled down again, hiring more consultants to run more workshops. She was convinced the problem was the entrenched attitudes of the remaining staff, not her new hires. The final nail in the coffin came from the internet. Anonymous, scathing reviews started appearing on workplace review sites. They described a company in freefall run by a CEO who valued buzzwords over skill. They mentioned the broken equipment, the lost clients, and the firing of the core team that had made the company successful. The stories were so specific and detailed that they were impossible to ignore. The company's reputation, once sterling, was now mud. The end came about 6 months after we were fired. Astrid called me one morning. She sounded exhausted. She said Scarlett had called an all-hands meeting and announced that the company was insolvent. They were declaring bankruptcy. The doors were closing for good that Friday. I felt a strange mix of sadness and vindication. Sadness for the end of an era, for the company the founder had built. Vindication that we had been right all along. A few weeks later, we were in our new, slightly larger workshop that we'd just moved into. We were testing a complex pneumatic system for a prop, and the place was filled with the hiss of compressed air and the whir of machinery. The roll-up door was open to let in the breeze. I looked up and saw a figure standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright sunlight. It was Scarlett. She looked completely different. No power suit, no confident posture. She was wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt, and she looked lost. The noise in the shop died down as everyone noticed her. She stepped inside, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. The bustling activity, the half-finished props, the sheer energy of the place. It was everything her company was supposed to be, and wasn't. She looked at me, then at Tanner and Braden. "I heard you were doing well," she said. Her voice was quiet, barely audible over the hum of the fans. Braden walked over, wiping his hands on a rag. "We're busy," he said. It wasn't hostile, just a statement of fact. "The company's gone," she said, stating the obvious. "I'm selling off the assets to pay the creditors." An awkward silence hung in the air. We didn't know what to say. What do you say to the person who fired you and then ran your dream job into the ground? Then her expression hardened slightly. A flicker of her old arrogance returned. She looked right at me. You all destroyed my father's legacy. Before I could even process the words, Tanner stepped forward. He had turned off his welding torch and lifted his mask. His face was calm, but his eyes were like steel. He looked her right in the eye. No, he said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the silence. We were your father's legacy. You're the one who set it on fire because your ideas were more important than reality. She just stared at him. She had no answer. The accusation in her eyes crumbled, replaced by something that looked a lot like shame. She held his gaze for a few seconds, then looked away. Without another word, she turned around and walked out of our workshop. We watched her go until she disappeared down the street. Nobody cheered. Nobody high-fived. Tanner just lowered his welding mask, and with a loud crackle, a bright blue arc flared to life. We all went back to work. A month later, Braden got a call from the bankruptcy auctioneer. He told us that the broken CNC milling machine from the old shop was up for sale. We bought it for pennies on the dollar. It took Tanner 2 days and about $50 in parts to get it running again. It now sits in the center of our workshop floor, humming away, turning out perfect components. A constant reminder that skill, hard work, and reality will always win in the end.